Hello there, people of the internet. This topic has been absolutely beaten into the ground. The AR versus the AK, which is it that you should go with? And I'm going to tell you right now, if you're a gun guy, by all means, you should go with the AR, especially if you know what you're doing with it, how it functions, and how to properly maintain it. However, the AR has a lot of really tight tolerances, and as you shoot it more and more and more, it becomes less and less reliable. And the reason for that has to do with like carbon buildup and fouling from just the powder that tends to build up. It's technically a piston system, but it more or less is a direct impingement system because it's got hot gas that comes back into the receiver to actually cycle the thing. But there's a lot that goes into the AR whenever it comes to maintenance. And I think just because of the maintenance aspect of the AR-15, that is not going to be the best option for the average person. The reality is that if we take everything into consideration, I would say that the AK is probably going to be the best firearm for the average person if we're talking about a properly made AK. There's some sketchy AKs out there made by some sketchy companies. I definitely would not recommend somebody go out and get one of these AKs that is clearly subpar. For the most part, a quick Google search will tell you which ones are good and which ones aren't. But take into consideration what the AK, in this particular case, one chambered in 7.62 by 39, what the AK does and what it has to offer. And take into consideration the capabilities of the average person, their needs, and their capabilities. Not only that, but their willingness to do what needs done in terms of maintenance of their firearm. Raise your hand if you have a bunch of guns, and you love your guns, and you go out and you shoot your guns all the time, and you also don't really clean them all that much. A lot of times people will go out and they'll send, I don't know, a couple mags through their AR or something like that, and whenever it starts getting sticky and whatnot, they might run some oil and whatnot through it. But the AR, if you're using it in a professional sense to where you need it to run 100% reliably, or you're using it as like a defensive firearm where you have to bet your life on it, just slabbing in some oil or cleaning out some funk with, say, some brake clean or something like that, that's not going to be good enough to be able to reliably get that AR up and functioning to the point to where you should be willing to bet your life on it. And that's about the extent that most people do whenever they clean their firearms. They clean it as subpar as possible to where they can continue to use it and enjoy it on the gun range effectively enough with as few malfunctions as possible to allow them to still be able to enjoy their time on the gun range. But you want no malfunctions if you're betting your life on it. So just because of the aspects of a lack of maintenance offered by your average person in comparison to what the AR-15 needs in order to become a tool willing or a tool worth betting your life on, I would not bet the average person who has never even held a gun, mind you. If we're talking about the average United States citizen, a dramatic number of them have never even fired a firearm, let alone know how to properly maintain and clean one. I would say the AR is probably not best for those guys, and the AK would be the best option because the AK, although, yes, it definitely runs better when lubricated, it doesn't need to be lubricated. It doesn't need to be cleaned or maintained. Just the way that the system is designed, it's not necessarily a self-cleaning system, but the way that the tolerances and whatnot are, and the way that the hot gas functions along the piston, and it's got those gas cuts to catch a majority of the fouling and whatnot, the way that this is it is designed to continue to run essentially endlessly. Even if you have a rotted out, rusted AK that is seized up, if you just kick the charging handle open, then you can take it out and continue to shoot it. These things literally are just rifles that continue to run and run and run. Of course, if you dunk one in mud, the tolerances on this are going to show that you have issue. I would not recommend using these in like trench warfare in World War I. But your average U.S. civilian is not going to be fighting in trenches in the mud and whatnot. And if they are, then things have gotten really, really, really bad. But your average U.S. civilian, with what they mostly go after in terms of hunting, the 7.62 by 39 here in the United States should be able to handle like 95% of all of the game that you're going after. There's some very few exceptions, in which case even a proper bullet type in your 7.62 by 39, like say a 150 grain proper bonded bullet or something like that, something that's actually designed to go after these bigger things, something like that could still be viable in the 7.62 by 39 platform. The point is that cartridge should be able to handle like 95% of the jobs that the US civilian would need that cartridge to handle. On top of that, most people aren't shooting beyond 300 yards at anything, and most of those people aren't shooting beyond 100 yards. Just statistically speaking, most people aren't doing that. Your AK has a side rail to where you can mount a scope to this thing if you felt like it. As a matter of fact, that's what I do whenever I take this AK out hunting. This particular one is quite accurate. I've gotten probably about 3-inch groups out of this particular AK with the right ammo and the right load and whatnot. But the point is that these right here, assuming that you have even just the dirt cheap bottom of the barrel 4 to 5 MOA Russian steel case ammo, it's still gonna fit the needs of what like 95% of people need a semi-auto self-loading rifle to do. You got that scope mount, or you can mount an optic to it depending on what it is that you want to use your AK for. External magazines, you got 30 rounds, that's your standard. You got 5 rounds out there depending on your hunting location if there is some sort of restriction for you. Or if you're gonna do it, like use it as a sentry gun or something like that, they got 100-round drones that you could plug into this thing. They got all sorts of accessories and whatnot that you could mount onto this, all sorts of rail systems that you could do to update your AK to be as modern as possible. But a lot of those systems and a lot of those attachments really aren't necessary for the average person, because the average person just isn't going to be really effectively using that rifle in the most tactical of situations. If you have a bunch of professionals and whatnot, I would recommend going with something like the AR because they'll know how to properly utilize that rifle. I would say the AR is probably the better of the two rifles just because it's the most effective. You can touch out to longer ranges with that 5.56 round, or you can swap calibers in that pretty gosh darn easily. But the average US civilian doesn't need those capabilities. The 7.62 by 39 cartridge, plenty potent out to the distances that most people would need to shoot at, which is within that 300 yards. And it's plenty powerful to handle most of the jobs that a US citizen would need to handle here in the United States. On top of that, not a whole lot of maintenance needs to be done with it. There's just a whole lot of pros whenever it comes to the AK. Now, on a more mechanical standpoint, if we start looking at the internals of the AK, there's very little to go wrong with it. You got your dust cover, you got your recoil spring, and then you got your bolt carrier and bolts. And this right here is pretty much all that most people would be taking apart with their AK system. And there's nothing to go wrong here. There's nothing to lose. I mean, the smallest piece here is your bolt versus something like the AR, which is very easy to disassemble. I'm not saying it's not easy, but there's small things in there that you can lose and lose very easily. Let's see, where is my M16? There we go. There's little tiny bits in these that can be lost very simply. Like, for example, if you got yourself a receiver that doesn't have captive pins in it, if you drop this, then your AR is essentially no longer, it's worthless. It's no longer going to be useful. So if you have one with captive pins, fantastic, but receivers do exist without captive pins. On top of that, let me pull this out right here. Your charging handle is a separate piece. If you pull this out with your bolt carrier group and you set it aside and you're like, oh no, this tall grass right here, I can't find my charging handle. This is a fairly large piece, like it's hard to lose, but it certainly is possible. Definitely a lot harder to lose than, say, an AK-47 bolt carrier group complete with piston. And now we got this right here. On your bolt carrier group, there is this right here. If you need to disassemble your bolt carrier group for any reason, there's this little cotter pin, and that thing is really small, and you have to disassemble this in order to get it to run reliably, because inside this system is where all the carbon and whatnot builds up, and that's one of the failure points of the AR platform, because This right here is your gas key, and that's where the gas imparts inside of the AR system to drive your bolt carrier back. There's more that goes into it than that, but I'm going to go ahead and try and keep that in as layman terms as possible. And you get carbon buildup on this little cam system and inside the little bolt track and whatnot. You have